Time now to see what's making headlines in today's papers in our news review. Pleased to say I'm joined by education and politics correspondent for The Scotsman, Katrina Stewart. Thanks so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you in the studio. As many people would imagine, the arrest and then subsequent release of Andrew, the former prince, dominates all of the front pages, Katrina. And I wondered if we just started zoned in on the Daily Telegraph, the front page there, with this haunting picture of the prince, with all the fears that must be wrapped up in what he's now experiencing. And it doubles down, doesn't it, on some of the details. He was held for hours on suspicion of misconduct in public office. He's the first senior member of the royal family to be taken into custody in modern history. We have to look back in the history books. It's King Charles I, I think, was the last person to be arrested. And then authorities, this is the message from the king in his statement that was released fairly early on in the proceedings on Thursday morning, saying that the authorities have our wholehearted support, adding that the law must take its course. And, you know, in all big news stories, you always remember, don't you, where you are when a big story breaks. So for me, it was the death of Princess Diana. I remember hearing on the news in the early hours, or the Twin Towers. You know, I remember watching Sky News as that plane smashed into the Twin Towers. And then this moment when I was putting away dishes, you know, on half term with the kids, and all the phones were pinging with this news alert. This is such a huge story in our history as a country.
It's an enormous story, and it is that interesting mixture of a shock, absolutely, yesterday, but also it wasn't the same sort of seismic shock as the Twin Towers or Princess Diana, because, of course, there have been warnings that this was potentially coming. The royal family certainly have been laying the ground in very much distancing themselves from Andrew. I mean, this photograph of him is on the front page of every single paper this morning other than the Financial Times. It is staring out from the newsstands, and the Daily Telegraph has chosen to go in on more of a colour intro rather than a hard news intro for their start to their story, and they are describing this image, which I think will become one of the defining pictures of our sort of era. And they're talking about Andrew Mountbatten Windsor being slumped in the back of the car, wild-eyed and exhausted, before going in to talk about all of the detail that you've referenced. And they've been out and about around the Sandringham estate. And there is one quite striking quote in this piece from a neighbour who says, "I think Andrew should have been locked up a long time ago. A lot of us do. He's always so miserable when you see him. He's got a miserable face." And I think of all the worries that people might have about Prince Andrew, or former Prince Andrew, his miserable face is one of the more minor ones. But it's interesting that they've put this on the front page.
Yeah, and the same, really, for the front page of the Eye. I think what it speaks to, you know, the headline on the front page of the Eye, "The King, my brother, must face the law," and it's the fall from grace of Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, who would have been potentially opening up police stations, cutting ribbons, not answering questions on a suspicion of misconduct in public office. Details from the front page of this story, Katrina, it was his 66th birthday, officers turned up, and he was treated in many ways as an ordinary person, as someone who would have had their photo taken, their fingerprints kept at the police station, questioned. He would have made moves to have legal representation. And it does speak to, I suppose, how nobody is above the law.
And rightly so. And I think one of the interesting things about the Eye paper front page as well is the headline. It says, "King, my brother must face the law." But the words "my brother" were strikingly missing from the King's statement yesterday. And as you say, that statement came out very swiftly. And the King Prince William and Catherine as well have been very firm and very swift in all of their dealings around the situation with Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. But this statement that the King put out yesterday was striking for several different reasons. But one, the fact that it was so curt and quite brutal with regards to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and not using the words my brother, but he did use the phrase my family. And it was very clear that when he used that expression, he was not talking about Andrew, he was talking about the rest of the family. And I think it just highlights how outside of the family of the firm that he is at the moment.
I thought that was a really interesting move. And he signed the statement, didn't he? Charles R. It was a very personal moment for a family now that does, like you say, want to distance themselves from someone who, you know, just 5 years ago was a very senior part, an integral part of the royal family. Let's take people watching to the front page of the Times next. What's quite interesting here is that there was no real tip-off to King Charles. This was out of the blue. The police turned up to the royal grounds to take in his brother, former Prince Andrew, which was an extraordinary moment, I think.
Yes, and I think he had to be treated exactly the way that any other member of the public would be treated. It would have been astonishing for a family in ordinary circumstances to be tipped off ahead of an arrest. And it is quite interesting that we have a much more casual relationship, I think, towards the royal family than we used to, and yet there is some sort of surprise and praise for the police for not treating Andrew differently to anybody else. The Times front pages is comprehensive. They've really managed to pack a lot onto the front. Again, another quite nice detail from the Times is that it's understood that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor's solicitor is nicknamed Good News Gary, and it seems like there's not going to be much good news coming from Gary in this particular situation. But the Times is also speaking about the royal family and saying the institution will be asked whether it protected Andrew, why it supported his appointment as trade envoy, and whether his controversial activities were scrutinised by officials and family members. And those are obviously crucial questions, but also speak to this quite curious relationship that we have with the royal family and the interesting position that the royal family is in, because you have someone who has consistently been said doesn't really know how to conduct himself properly, is arrogant, is not particularly academic, and yet busy work needs to be found for satellite members of the royal family. And his busy work was to put him in a really significant position as a trade envoy, one that he, by all accounts, seemed completely unsuitable for. And now this is the position that he finds himself in. And the ramifications for the royal family, for the government, remain to be seen.
Yeah, many commentators saying that this potentially the biggest crisis that the royal family will ever face. And the King's statement in this Times piece, really quite interesting. I know a lot of them carry the statement too, but it's part of the sub-headline here, the law must take its course, suggesting that the royal family will help in any way they can with this investigation, which is, I think, crucial.
Absolutely. And this is obviously an extremely difficult situation for the royal family, and it comes at a tipping point in the public's relationship with the royal family. We don't have the same sort of reverence that we used to for them. We are all, as Brits, subjects, technically, of the royal family, but I'm not really sure that anybody feels that with any sense of importance in the way that we once might have done. And so they are the royal family by consent. They do have to make overtures to the country to set a good example, to make themselves of value to the country. And so this situation is incredibly difficult. And it will be interesting to see how the royal family, how the King and William and Kate as senior royals navigate their way through this and what the ramifications ultimately are.
Yeah, OK, we'll leave that story for now. There are other stories that we will try and squeeze in before the end of the hour, Katrina. Starting with The Guardian, what can you tell me about this story? Dual citizens could use old passports to prove status.
Yes, this is a story that has been rumbling on for a while, that I don't think has been having as much coverage as it perhaps could have.
Yes.
Declare an interest as a dual national myself. I actually found out about this situation from my cousin in Australia, which is probably something as a journalist I should be admitting to. I should maybe have been across it well in advance, but the passport rules are changing in the UK, which means that dual nationals will have to come to the country on a British passport. Previously, you could apply for a visa or travel on an overseas passport. And this change affects about 1.2 million people globally. And some are saying that actually it will be easier just to renounce their British citizenship rather than apply for a new passport. So say you've lived in Australia for 20 years, you don't know where your British birth certificate is, you don't have the documents required to apply for a UK passport, you potentially wouldn't be able to come back to the UK. The government say that they have made dual nationals aware of this, that they have trailed this well in advance, but actually many people are saying they had no idea about this. It's having huge implications for people who would be travelling imminently. They might not be able to. And so Ryanair is saying that they would accept some other form of documentation for boarding the flight. It's one thing to get on a flight and arrive in a country. It's another when you face border control and you can't get through passport control. So it seems like a niche issue, but actually it will have ramifications for people.
Huge ramifications. And also just reading here that you could get a certificate, but that costs up to £500, almost £600 to add on to that foreign passport. But it's one of those things when you get to the airport, you haven't looked at the details and you're suddenly stung, which is quite terrifying. Wonder if we've got enough time to end on. It's in the Daily Mirror. And just to cheer up everyone, I don't know if this will cheer up anyone, actually. It's their headline's quite cool. It's Reigning Champion. And this is all about, Katrina, the UK's wettest place. It recorded 50 straight days of rain yesterday. Can you guess where it might be? Or do you know?
I should know because I have it in front of me. I just can't find it.
It's in Cardingham in Cornwall, and it has rained every day this year, with their last recorded dry day on December the 30th. Which is incredible. They received more than their normal rainfall in February. You know, I've actually been to the wettest place on earth, which is Cherrapunji in India. So my next challenge is that I have to go down in Cornwall and visit the wettest place in England, which is down in Cornwall. Listen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for your company, Katrina. Great to see you. We'll be back after the break. I'll be joined by Matt Barbette. Do stay with Sky News.
What's the best thing about being a Sky News presenter?